What does it take to rule one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world, when everything about that civilization insists that you should not? Over 3,400 years ago, a woman who had been a royal daughter, a great royal wife, and a regent became Pharaoh of Egypt, held power for more than 2 decades, and built monuments that still stand today, before later rulers attempted to erase her from the historical record entirely. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Hatshepsut is often discussed as an anomaly, a woman who somehow slipped through the barriers of a male-dominated institution. But the more instructive question is how she built and sustained her authority within a system that had no template for what she was doing. Tonight, we turn to a pharaoh whose reign demonstrates how political intelligence, religious legitimacy, and monumental architecture could be combined to construct royal authority from an entirely unprecedented position. The question is not whether Hatshepsut was remarkable, but what her reign reveals about how power is made legitimate, and what happens when the person holding power does not fit the model that legitimacy was designed to support.
Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for approximately 20 years, likely from around 1473 to 1458 before the Common Era. During that time she oversaw a period of remarkable stability and prosperity, conducted one of the most celebrated trading expeditions in Egyptian history, and built a mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari that remains one of the most architecturally distinctive structures of the ancient world.
We are speaking about Hatshepsut, 5th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom of Egypt, daughter of Thutmose I, and one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world.
She did not seize power through violence or conspiracy. She constructed it methodically, using every institutional and religious resource available to her, and she did so within a tradition that had produced very few female rulers before her.
Then let us begin with the political situation that opened the path to her rule, and how she transformed a temporary regency into a permanent reign.
Hatshepsut was born the daughter of Thutmose I, a successful military pharaoh who expanded Egyptian territory into Nubia and the Levante. She grew up within the royal court, received an education appropriate to her status, and became deeply familiar with the religious and administrative institutions of the Egyptian state. When her father passed away, she married her half-brother, who became Thutmose II. Thutmose II reigned for a relatively short time before his life ended, leaving as his successor a young son, Thutmose III, born of a secondary wife rather than of Hatshepsut. The child was too young too. Hatshepsut, as the great royal wife and the daughter of a pharaoh, was the logical figure to serve as regent. This was not unprecedented. Royal women had served as regents before.
So her initial position was entirely within the established conventions of Egyptian royal practice.
Yes. And here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Hatshepsut is sometimes presented as having usurped the throne from Thutmose III, or as having suppressed a legitimate male king through political manipulation. The historical evidence does not support this. Thutmose III was recognized throughout her reign, continued to hold military titles, and eventually became one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs after her death. The two appear to have governed in a kind of parallel arrangement, with Hatshepsut holding the primary royal authority. Within approximately 2 years of beginning her regency, Hatshepsut had assumed the full titles and regalia of pharaoh. She took the throne name Mat-Kare, meaning truth is the soul of the sun god. She wore the double crown, the false beard, and the other symbols of pharaonic authority. She had herself depicted in royal statuary and relief carving in the traditional pharaonic form, sometimes with a masculine body, sometimes with feminine features, and sometimes in ways that combined both.
So, the iconography itself was a negotiation between the requirements of the office and the reality of who held it.
Precisely. The pharaoh in Egyptian tradition was not simply a political ruler. The pharaoh was a theological position, the living embodiment of Horus and the son of the sun god Amun. The symbols of kingship, the crowns, the crook and flail, the false beard, were not decorative. They were ritual objects that defined the office. Hatshepsut's adoption of these symbols was a claim to occupy the theological position, not merely to perform its administrative functions. To reinforce this claim, she developed a divine birth narrative. Inscriptions at Deir el-Bahari depict the god Amun taking the form of her father, Thutmose I, and fathering her direct, establishing her divine legitimacy through a theological fiction that bypassed the problem of gender entirely.
So she used the existing religious framework to construct a legitimacy that the framework had not been designed to provide.
Yes, and this pattern of working within and extending existing conventions, rather than challenging them directly, characterizes her entire approach to power. She did not argue that a woman could be Pharaoh. She argued that she was Pharaoh, and she deployed every available institutional and theological resource to make that argument in visual and textual form across the monuments of her kingdom. The expedition to Punt, which she dispatched during her reign, is one of the most documented events in her biography, and one of the most vivid episodes in Egyptian historical records. Punt was a trading partner of Egypt, located somewhere along the East African or Arabian coastline. The precise location remains debated. Egypt had traded with Punt before, but the expedition under Hatshepsut was unusually large, well organized, and extensively recorded.
So the expedition was also a statement of royal capacity and ambition?
Exactly. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict the expedition in considerable detail, showing the Egyptian fleet arriving in Punt, the exchange of goods with the local rulers, and the loading of the ships with incense trees, ebony, ivory, animal skins, and live animals. Hatshepsut presented the expedition as a divine mandate fulfilled, a demonstration that the gods approved of her reign by delivering to Egypt the luxury goods that the temples required. Her building program was equally ambitious. She erected 2 pairs of obelisks at Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes, and commissioned monuments and inscriptions across Egypt and Nubia. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, is the architectural achievement most closely associated with her reign. Its terrace design, colonnaded facades, and integration with the natural landscape represent a departure from earlier mortuary temple architecture that influenced Egyptian building for generations.
So she left a physical record of her reign across the landscape of Egypt that was designed to be permanent and unmistakable.
Yes, and this investment in monumental construction served a political function beyond the aesthetic or religious. Monuments were claims on the future. They inscribed the pharaoh's name and deeds into stone that was intended to endure for eternity. For Hatshepsut, whose authority rested on a precedent that had no clear institutional foundation, the permanence of stone was especially important. The official who appears most prominently alongside Hatshepsut in the records of her reign is Senenmut, her chief steward, and the overseer of her building projects. He was a man of non-royal birth who rose to extraordinary prominence through his association with the queen and pharaoh, eventually holding over 80 official titles simultaneously. His precise relationship to Hatshepsut has been the subject of speculation since antiquity, but the historical record does not resolve the question definitively.
So he was the most powerful non-royal official in Egypt during her reign, and the nature of his relationship to her remains genuinely uncertain.
Yes, what is not uncertain is his administrative and architectural role. The distinctive design of the Deir el-Bahari temple is attributed in part to his oversight and possibly to his direct input into the design process. His own tomb, which he constructed near the temple, was unusually elaborate for a non-royal official, and reflects the exceptional position he occupied within Hatshepsut's administration. The New Kingdom context in which Hatshepsut ruled is essential for understanding both her opportunities and her constraints. The 18th dynasty had come to power around 1550, before the Common Era, following the expulsion of the Hyksos, foreign dynasty that had controlled northern Egypt for over a century. The rulers who followed worked to restore and expand Egyptian power, resulting in a period of extraordinary military success, territorial expansion, and material wealth. The royal court at Thebes was one of the richest in the ancient world.
So she inherited a prosperous and politically secure state, which gave her the freedom to pursue a reign defined by construction and diplomacy, rather than defense or conquest.
Yes, and this context matters for assessing her legacy fairly. A female regent inheriting an unstable or threatened state would have faced different pressures than the ones Hatshepsut actually faced. The stability she presided over was partly her achievement, and partly the inheritance she had received. Distinguishing between the two is difficult, but both factors contributed to what her reign was able to become. The religious dimension of her reign extended beyond the divine birth narrative. She was closely associated with the cult of Amun, the dominant deity of the New Kingdom, and her building program at Karnak, the great temple complex at Thebes, was a sustained investment in the most important religious institution in Egypt. By positioning herself as Amun's primary patron and servant, she aligned her political authority with the most powerful religious force in the country.
So her religious patronage and her political authority were mutually reinforcing.
Yes, the Amun priesthood, as we noted in our discussion of Akhenaten, was one of the most powerful institutional forces in Egypt. Hatshepsut's investment in Karnak gave her a strong alliance with that institution. This is one reason her reign was stable. She worked with the existing power structures rather than against them, which is precisely the opposite of what Akhenaten did a generation later, with such catastrophic results. The question of how ordinary Egyptians experienced her reign is one that the evidence cannot answer directly. The surviving record is almost entirely royal and elite. What we can say is that the material prosperity of the period, evidenced by the scale of construction and the extent of trading activity, suggests a functioning administrative and economic system. The temples that were built required enormous numbers of craftsmen, laborers, and administrators. The trading expeditions required sailors, soldiers, and logistical organization. Her reign generated employment and activity on a substantial scale.
So the monuments were not only political statements, but economic activities that reached well beyond the court.
Yes, and this is worth holding in mind when evaluating the significance of her building program. It was not simply self-promotion. It was a form of economic activity that distributed wealth and generated skilled labor throughout the country. The pharaonic building tradition served multiple functions simultaneously: religious, political, economic, and artistic, and Hatshepsut's contribution to it was substantial by any measure.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand how Hatshepsut constructed and maintained her authority, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Hatshepsut, the Female Pharaoh by Joyce Tildesley.
So this is a biography that takes seriously both the political strategies and the religious and architectural dimensions of her reign.
Tildesley examines how Hatshepsut rose from royal daughter and queen to become pharaoh during the 18th dynasty. The book explores the political strategies, religious symbolism, and architectural achievements that defined her reign, including the famous temple complex at Deir el-Bahri and the trading expedition to the land of Punt. Drawing on archaeological evidence and historical sources, it shows how Hatshepsut established a stable and prosperous period of rule while navigating the traditions of a society where kingship had long been dominated by men.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in Egyptology?
Tildesley writes for a general audience and builds the necessary context here. A reader with no prior knowledge of ancient Egypt will find the book engaging and informative. She is honest about the limits of the evidence while still constructing a vivid and coherent portrait of the period.
So it gives the reader both the historical person and the institutional world she operated within.
Precisely. And Tildesley is particularly good on the archaeological dimension, explaining how the physical evidence of Hatshepsut's reign was gradually recovered and reassembled after centuries of deliberate erasure.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Hatshepsut's life ended around 1458 before the Common Eras. Thutmose III, who had waited throughout her reign, now ruled alone and became one of the most prolific military pharaohs in Egyptian history. Sometime during his reign, or possibly later, a systematic effort began to remove Hatshepsut's name and image from monuments across Egypt. Her statues were destroyed or buried. Her cartouche was replaced with those of Thutmose I, the second, or the third. At Deir el-Bahri, her image was chiseled from reliefs. The motivation for this erasure has been debated for over a century. The most straightforward explanation is that it was carried out to ensure a clear male succession, removing from the official record any precedent that a woman could hold the pharaonic office. A more recent interpretation suggests that the erasure occurred late in Thutmose III's reign, and was connected to the desire to transfer credit for her achievements to his own lineage, rather than to any personal animosity.
So the erasure may have been about institutional control of the future, rather than revenge for the past.
Yes, and this interpretation is consistent with the incomplete nature of the erasure. If the goal had been total obliteration, it was not achieved. Many of her images and inscriptions survived, particularly in less accessible locations. The erasure was thorough enough to remove her from the official king lists that later Egyptians used to understand their own history, but not thorough enough to prevent modern archaeology from reconstructing her reign in considerable detail. The modern rediscovery of Hatshepsut began in the 19th century, when Egyptologists examining the Deir el-Bahri temple noticed that the inscriptions referred to a pharaoh in grammatically feminine forms. The identity of this ruler was gradually established through comparative analysis of cartouches, statuary fragments, and textual references across multiple sites. The confirmation of her identity and the reconstruction of her reign has been one of the major achievements of 20th and 21st century Egyptology.
So the archaeology reversed the erasure that the ancient record had attempted.
Yes, and this reversal is itself historically significant. The tools of modern archaeology, including epigraphy, comparative iconography, and the analysis of deliberately damaged or buried artifacts, were able to recover a reign that ancient political decisions had attempted to remove from history. The stone Hatshepsut had invested in so heavily proved more durable than the political will to erase her. The broader legacy of her reign is visible in several dimensions. Her building program contributed to the development of Egyptian architectural tradition, particularly in the design of terraced temples integrated with natural landscape. The expedition to Punt was referenced by later pharaohs as a model for royal trading activity. Her use of the divine birth narrative as a legitimating device was adopted by subsequent rulers, including Amenhotep III and later Ramesses II.
So the tools she developed to legitimate her own unusual position became part of the standard repertoire of royal ideology.
Exact. And this is one of the more instructive aspects of her legacy. The innovations she developed under the pressure of an unprecedented political situation proved useful enough to be adopted by rulers who faced no such pressure. The solutions to difficult problems often turn out to have wider applications than the problems that produced them. Her modern relevance is perhaps most visible in the questions her reign poses about how authority is constructed and who gets to hold it. The Egyptian tradition of pharaonic kingship was not a simple matter of hereditary succession. It was a complex institutional and theological construction that required continuous maintenance through ritual, imagery, and monumental statement. Hatshepsut's ability to insert herself into and sustain that construction reveals how much institutional authority depends not on fixed rules, but on the continuous performance of legitimacy.
So her story is ultimately about how power is made rather than simply inherited or seized.
Yes, and in that sense her reign speaks directly to contemporary questions about authority, representation, and the conditions under which established institutions can accommodate figures who do not fit their original design. Hatshepsut did not change the institution of pharaonic kingship. She occupied it, and in occupying it, she demonstrated that the institution was more capacious than it had appeared, and perhaps more capacious than those who later erased her wanted it to be.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the Regency, the divine birth narrative, the expedition to Punt, the temple at Deir el-Bahari, and the long erasure and recovery of Hatshepsut.
Hatshepsut reminds us that the most durable form of power is not the kind that eliminates its rivals, but the kind that leaves something in stone that outlasts the people who tried to remove it.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.